Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, June 2nd, 2016. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, our roving reporter Will Gallaspy talks to craft brewer Kelly Ryan of Fork and Brewer in Wellington, New Zealand. Kelly plays with all kinds of fun stuff to make out-of-the-box beers. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And if you buy any of our DVD combos, you get a free basic brewing bottle opener. And don't forget to get a copy of our Brewer's Logbook. You can use it to log and track up to 50 batches of beer. You can find me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. We also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon shopping, think of us first and click on our associate link before shopping on Amazon. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show, and we greatly appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on basicbrewing.com. You can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes, our Android app on Amazon.com. We have a Windows Phone app. We're on the BlackBerry Podcast Directory. We're on the Stitcher app. And we're on Google Play Music as well. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our virtual guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support. And thanks to everybody who's done so already. This is a rare June episode of Basic Brewing Radio. As I said on this past week's show, we generally take the month of June off, but this year, June has 5 Thursdays, so I'm sneaking into June territory this week. It works out well, though, because we have another great conversation from Will Gallaspy, our roving reporter from 32 North in San Diego. But next week, Steve Wilkes, Andy Sparks, and I are flying to Baltimore for the National Homebrewers Conference, or HomebrewCon. We're meeting up with Mike Tonsmeyer, who's going to show us around a bit. Very excited about that. We might even get a peek into the Mad Fermentationist's cellar to try some experiments that he's been doing. So, woohoo, boy. I'm all a tingle. And one event that we're planning on being at is the release of the Right Proper DC Homebrewers Meridian Pint Collaborative Berliner Weiss. And that's happening Wednesday, June 8th from 5 to midnight. That's happening at Meridian Pint at 3400 11th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. So that's one thing. It's supposed to be a 4% Berliner Weiss, which sounds awesome. So check that out if you're in the area. I don't know that we'll be there all the way from 5 to midnight. We've got to eat sometime, but probably earlier the better there. Hope to see you around the area. Let's take a look into the mailbag. Tyler from Waco, Texas is just getting into brewing. He's brewed some extract batches and such, and he says, I want to brew more this summer, and I want to do all grain. I also need a brew kettle, however, and was wondering if it would be possible to use the same pot I mash in to brew in. I'm a poor college student, so I'm trying to do things in an efficient manner. I found a nice brew kettle for around $150, but also found the same one with fittings and fittings for mashing for $200. I was hoping I could mash in this pot with direct heat and mash out to a fermentation bucket, clean the kettle out, and then transfer back to the kettle to boil. I know this is extra time to a brew day, but that is not a huge issue for me. I am also aware that brew in a bag is a popular thing, but I would like to learn the process of using a mash tun. Do you see any problems with the method I proposed? Well, Tyler? Yes. Why go to all the trouble of mashing in a kettle, which is essentially what I mean. Once you mash in a kettle, it's the same thing as mashing in a mash tun. Basically, it means the same theory. Why would you go to all the trouble of mashing in that kettle, draining it out into a bottling bucket, cleaning that kettle, and then returning the wort back into the same kettle? It's just so much extra work. Just get a good kettle, which is a good investment. $150 is a good, you need a decent kettle. You'll use that for a long time. Just get one with a good volume. get a kettle and a nylon bag and do brew in a bag. That way, when you mash in the kettle, which is a lot like mashing in a cooler, when that mash is over, just take out the bag. Squeeze it if you want to. I do. Get you some good thick rubber gloves so you can squeeze the bag safely. And then begin your boil. Your wort's already there. You can sparge if you want to. If you want to suspend the grain over the thing or dip the bag into a second pot, smaller pot to sparge. If you want to do that, you can do that. I've done that in the past. People who listen to the show hear this spiel a lot. But there is still a lot of resistance to brew in a bag out there in the homebrew community. And for instance, I ran into another brewer several weeks back at the homebrew store who was looking for parts to make a mash tun. He was having trouble figuring the whole thing out because he was mixing and mashing parts that he got at the hardware store already, and he already bought the cooler. And I suggested, he was getting frustrated, and I suggested he just get a nylon bag and go with that. And it took me a while to explain the concept to him, but in the end, I think he thought it was a great way to get into all grain. He sounded excited about it, but he'd already bought the mash tun. He'd already bought into the mash tun setup thing in his head, and so off he went with that. And so, probably had a lot more work to put together the mash tun and all that, and that's fine. If that's what's making him happy, that's great. But and I know how that goes. You get a picture in your head of a certain situation. You think about how you're going to solve that particular problem, how you're going to build this one setup. And then if somebody comes at you sideways and says, hey, you know what? Here's something completely different from what you're doing. You're going to be really resistant to change your course. However, in Tyler's situation, since he's just getting started, he hadn't gotten anything yet. I hope that he'll try the bag approach first. Get a good kettle that can, and I hope that he's got a good stove. Brewing in a bag is simpler and a better setup for him, especially since he's a student with limited funds to play with, and I'm assuming a limited space. And then, if he wants to add more bells and whistles, more pieces to his gear, add a mash tun, dedicated mash tun later, and play with that, excellent. But to get into all grain brewing, brew in a bag is the way to go. But where this is leading? That was a good mailbag on its own. I hope that, and I'm corresponding with Tyler because he's coming back with, I hear the beers aren't as clear and their efficiency's not as good. So there's some myths I've got to help him with brew in a bag. So I'm still, it's an ongoing conversation. But where this is leading, this part of the show, a mention of our sponsors, Desiree and Dave from High Gravity in Tulsa. Steve and I have electric brew-in-a-bag systems from High Gravity, but High Gravity also sells more traditional three-tier brewing systems. So if that is your paradigm, as they say in the corporate world, you can go that way with a great electric brewing system from High Gravity. The Build Your Own Electric Brewing System feature on highdgravitybrew.com lets you customize your system to fit your needs. High Gravity offers systems that can brew 5 gallons all the way up to 2 barrels. So if you want to do a startup, pro system, 2 barrels, they can help you out. You can choose from a variety of controllers that control your heat and pumps, and you can pick the one that is right for you. And in fact, you can see Desiree and Dave talk about the different controllers, what makes them different, what their capabilities are. You can find that video of Desiree and Dave on their YouTube channel, youtube.com/highgravitybrew. So check that out. And I hope that when Tyler gets out of college and lands an awesome job, he can upgrade whatever system he goes with something wonderful from Desiree and Dave at High Gravity Brew. highgravitybrew.com. Looking forward to seeing Desiree and Dave in Baltimore in person next week. They only live, like a couple hours away in Tulsa, but have to go all the way to Baltimore to see him. Actually, I think I'm planning Steve and I were talking about going over to see Desiree and Dave over in Tulsa, and that may happen before our trip to Baltimore. Okay, now on to Will's interview with Kelly Ryan of Fork and Brewer in Wellington, New Zealand. Kelly shares some advice on brewing with Brettanomyces, lactobacillus, yogurt culture, champagne yeast, wet hopping, and lots of other fun stuff. Will Gallaspy, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks, James. It's good to be back.
Now, we're going on with your travel log, your mini travel log from your travels in New Zealand. And last week you talked to a homebrew, or not a homebrew, a professional brewing pioneer in New Zealand. And this week you're talking to someone who is kind of the next generation?
I believe so. I think he talks about his background a little bit in the interview, so you can kind of pay attention and hear that bit for yourself. But yes, I mean, he was certainly a younger guy than Ben, but had also done some work in some larger breweries in New Zealand, and is now brewing at a spot called Fork and Brewer in Wellington, which made beer that I thought was very, very impressive. Great little brew pub, just very kind of there in central Wellington. I think they had something like 15 different kinds of beers on tap, and they were almost all excellent. I say almost because I didn't try them all, but I'm sure they were all great. I had a pale ale there called God's Own Pale Ale, which is probably one of the best pale ales I've ever had in my life, and was another one of those experiences that kind of changed the way I think about brewing and the way I think about a given ingredient. In this case, New Zealand hops. There's just no substitute for traveling to the countries of origin where these beer styles are made and tasting them for yourself in the place where people drink. And that was the experience I had at Fork and Brewer. And I was actually there very late at night. I was there something like near midnight, kind of capping off an evening. And I liked the beer so much, I got the brewer's email and dashed off an email to him immediately, hoping that I could catch him the next day, and I managed to. On the day this interview was recorded, I was riding my skateboard all over Wellington, which is pretty easy to do because it's very hilly and very small. And I was just going around to homebrew shops and honey shops and different breweries, tasting as many things as I could. And it was an exciting day because this was the day that the wet hops had been made available to commercial brewers and home brewers alike. And so when I went to the homebrew shop, everyone was there picking up their freshly picked Nelson Sauvin hops. And when I got to Fork and Brewer, Kelly Ryan had just gotten his freshly picked hops as well, and he was putting them into a beer called Champagne Supernova, which is a very interesting product that he's going to talk all about in this interview.
And I thought, now that's an interesting name for a beer, and to show how old I am, I Googled Champagne Supernova, and it wasn't a beer that showed up. So
right. Many of his beers seem to be named after songs.
And he hasn't gotten in trouble with the copyright police yet.
Yeah, I hope we don't cause him any problems.
Well, he's all the way down there in New Zealand, so maybe he'll cut some slack or something.
Those Oasis guys do strike me as litigious, so hopefully they're not beer fans.
Now, I take it from listening to the conversation that Kelly thinks out of the box.
I would definitely say that's true, and like a lot of really good brewers you'll meet, he's got a great formal training. He's very well versed in conventional techniques, but he also, via his own experience and experimentation, has learned where it serves him to deviate from those.
So, there's kind of a list of things that he's doing different with this particular beer, right?
Yes, and I'm going to be honest, it's been a few weeks since I listened to the interview, so I couldn't exactly rattle them off, but I definitely learned a thing or two from him in our conversation, and I'm sure anyone else who hears this interview will as well. If you're interested in sour beers, if you're interested in New Zealand hops, if you're interested in making strong and flavorful and unconventional IPAs, I think that you'll probably pick up a little something from this chat with Kelly Ryan.
So do you remember another example of some of a standout of one of his beers that kind of didn't fit in easily recognizable categories?
Yeah, he'd made one called Yogurt and Bruce Lee, which, as I was traveling around New Zealand, muesli is obviously a big thing there. I was offered that for breakfast several times. always in heaping portions, and I enjoyed it very much. And so he made a beer, I think that kind of, I don't know if it's supposed to necessarily taste like a bowl of yogurt and cereal, but he kind of took the idea and he put a lot of cereal grains into a beer, and it's a sour beer that he made with a culture that he got from yogurt, which was very good. I tried it.
Well, that's I've never eaten so much sausage as when I was down there. I don't know if it was just we had sausages. There was a cookout when we got there, and there were sausages there, and there were sausages at the homebrew competition. There were sausages at the March Fest. I was like, my gosh, they were all good, but my waistline showed the effect of that. But
yeah, they definitely have American portions.
And pies. Andy was all about the pies.
I definitely put on some weight down there.
Well, you could afford to. Well, let's get on to your conversation with Kelly Ryan. I'm sure if you listen closely, you can gain some homebrew knowledge in there that you could use for your own brews. And it's really fun to listen to somebody who's energetic about his brews and likes thinking out of the box. So thanks again, Will.
Absolutely. Thank you, James.
We're here at the Fork and Brewer in Wellington, and it's a very special day because here local brewer Kelly Ryan has just gotten a nice fresh shipment of Nelson Sauvin whole flower wet hops. And tell us a little bit about the flavor and the aroma you expect to get out of these.
Well, pretty much the first thing you do when you get the freshest of fresh hops is break them open and smash open those lovely lupulin glands. And first thing you get is just pure grapefruit oil. I mean, for me, all I get is this wonderful kind of like cross between tangerine or tangelo and grapefruit, as if though you've got the skin and just cracked it open and shot those oils up your nose. So that's the hope. The hope for me is to translate that into the beer. It's the same hop that I used last year for our green hop beer. Did a beer called Game of Cones, which was an Imperial India Pale Lager, and a similar amount. It's around 20 grams of fresh hops per litre of beer in terms of the ratio. I should do the imperial measurement for that, but I'm not going to. The American, put it into American units.
We'll get out our converters.
Yeah. So many. Oh, actually, I could probably do it quickly. If it's roughly 44 pounds of hops in about 9 American barrels.
Okay.
So of green hops. They'll steep. What I've done is done a primary fermentation with Brettanomyces bruxellensis, and it's yielded about a 7% alcohol beer. The final gravity was around 1,006.7, so that'll hopefully give me just enough residual sugar because I want this beer dry. It's called Champagne Supernova, and I really want it to be sort of not super high bitterness Brett fermented IPA. It's sort of only around 30 BUs, but with that dryness it will be perceived a lot higher. That's the plan of attack anyway. This Brett strain is amazingly fruity. You get awesome tropical fruits and mangoes and pineapples in particular. So the idea is that there'll be a really good sort of combination between that really lovely citrus peel aromatic from the fresh hops and what I've got already from the yeast. So it'll go in, I'll let it heat up, warm up naturally up to 18 degrees again, pitch some champagne yeast, cap the fermenter and let it naturally carbonate with whatever residual sugar that champagne yeast can pick up, and then drop it down and give it a nice filter, and a pretty rough filter. Hopefully not infect all my filters with any crazy yeast.
I was going to ask about that.
Fine. I've done about 20 different yeast strains through this brewery so far, and yet to pick up any infection.
And that's with all of the same equipment?
All of the same hoses, same equipment.
Cleaned in the same manner?
I've probably got the advantage of once being a brewery microbiologist for some big breweries and knowing a few little tricks and things in terms of cleaning. Effectively do it hotter than you could ever imagine, and if you can go triple strength, do it with all your cleaning chemicals. And it's something that with sort of wheat beer strains and Belgian strains I'll generally do anyway, because I've got my house strain as well. But in terms of house strain, I'm only generally running at about 12 generations before I start propagation again. So that's sort of what I'm doing today. So it's I've got these. Cheers, guys. See you later. I've got these big massive bags, 4 or 5 kilo bags hanging from my spray ball in the middle of the tank, and and we're purging as we speak. I've done 2 purges. I want to get as much oxygen out as possible. But one really cool thing about Brettanomyces is that it doesn't mind oxygen. So as that warms up, if there is any residual oxygen there and residual sugar, that Brett plus the champagne yeast is just going to go sweet and chew straight through it and not give me any nasty, weird isovaleric character. So yeah, that's the plan for today.
So the beer is called Champagne Supernova, and it is, would you call it an IPA or a pale ale?
It's probably, in terms of perceived bitterness, the concept is very much an IPA. It's kind of a multi-grain IPA. I've used like rye malt, and I've used a little bit of spelt in there as well. So there's a few bits and bobs that are a bit interesting. I do a beer here called Yogurt and Bruisley, which is a multi-grain sour ale that I do a kettle souring with 2 strains of lactic acid producing bacteria. One Lactobacillus delbrueckii, the classic one, and the other one's called Streptococcus thermophilus. So it's actually a yogurt culture. They work really well in tandem together and give me a pretty good pH drop over about 40 or 44 hours down to around 3.6. So I usually I stabilise the wort prior to sterilisation at 4.8, just to. So what that does, what I've found, and what a lot of research tends to show it from, that it's been done in the VLB over in Berlin with the Berliner Weiss sort of brewers, is that when you're going down to a pH of 4.8, lactobacillus like chewing up protein, and you want to have those nice medium chain proteins there to enable foam stability later on in the process. So by dropping that pH down just a little bit, it inhibits the sort of proteinase activity a little bit from those lactobacillus. So the idea is to get a slightly more stable glycoprotein matrix in the foam. So it generally works. I generally get pretty good sort of foam stability on my sour beers here, which is pretty good. Or something like that. Yeah, a bit of like random science, but it's
that's what we're here for.
Yeah, but it works. I mean, it's so I'll get about a 1.2 pH drop in about between 40 and 44 hours, depending on the strength of the wort. My next sort of thought is to actually play around with adding lactose and hopefully getting a faster turnaround, because lactobacillus will convert lactose to lactic acid a lot more quickly than all other sugars. So if I can sort of speed up and make their metabolic processes a little easier, then I might get a faster souring, and it'll be a little bit easier for me as a brewer. I won't have to come in at all hours checking pHs and making sure it's bang on for boiling it and getting rid of the lacto. So
our principal product at 32 North is a kettle soured Berliner Weiss, and it has definitely handed me some challenges.
Yeah, they are definitely they're a labour of love in a way. Like I've done one with a brewery up in Oregon called Gigantic Brewing, and it was a collaboration between them and a brewery in Calgary in Canada called Wild Rose. They were over here a couple of years ago, and we did this beer called Tainted Love, which is a passion fruit and juniper sour ale. And it was actually Ben Love from Gigantic up in Portland that sort of came up with this idea when we started talking about a collaboration. So he does a boysenberry sour called Boys in the Hood, and which is a fantastic name. And they actually in the US, you guys have a lot of like fat-free everything. In New Zealand, we tend to not really have that.
I
much
noticed.
Sort of
I think I've
stuff.
gained about 4 pounds since I got off the plane.
Yeah, and that's just from beer. Yeah,
Right.
So it's I was just like, what's the next best thing? So yeah, again with my background being sort of microbiology, I was like, well, what can I use? I've got some friends that work for companies that supply bacteria strains to the dairy industry. So made some phone calls and got this really awesome pure culture. So it's good. Yeah, it's good fun. So challenging.
So anyway, back to Champagne Supernova. So this is a pale ale. Now, was it also hopped with wet hops?
The pale ale. So initially, no, it was done with just Nelson Sauvin and a little bit of Southern Cross.
Okay.
So that's how I got my bitterness into it. And then it's just going to go on to these fresh Nelson Sauvin, and I'll probably try it near the end of the re-fermentation, and then I might even add some more dry hop Nelson Sauvin as well. But the whole premise of this beer is to get this lovely, a little bit of that kind of doughy breadiness that you can get in some champagne, and that's from the grains that I've used. And then the next thing is, it's probably about 20% wheat malt as well. And then the next thing is to get that lovely fruitiness as well. So that's that combination of yeast fruit and hop fruit. So yeah, I'll do it to taste, you know. So it's an experiment.
Was the primary fermentation 100% Brett?
Correct, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and how long does it take you to carry that out?
Just one moment, I can have a look at my water.
Sure.
days.
So that's an 11-day primary fermentation with Brett, and now it's getting transferred onto these dry hops. 44 pounds of wet, whole flour, Nelson Sauvin.
Yeah, that's it. And the really cool thing as well is that the Brett strain is the strain, or half of the strain. I did a repropagation just using the Y yeast culture that I brought in, but I've still got it going from the very first yogurt and brews I did, which was in March, a year ago. I actually used it, and I was like, right, I'll do an experiment and put it into 50 litres of wort, and within 3 days it had fermented out. And it had been sitting in cold storage for 9 months.
Tenacious.
So amazing, what an amazing yeast strain, and it's awesome. And no off characters, it just was healthy and happy and fruity and delicious. So it's a pretty cool strain.
And so then that begs the question, why add the champagne yeast as well? And talk to us about that. Are you just putting dried yeast into the fermenter here?
I'll make a slurry first.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm still deciding, depending on if I want to look and see if there's any re-fermentation. This is pretty much finished. So I've got a couple of options. One, I could prime it and add the champagne yeast, but the hope is just to get it a little drier. I want it to be kind of a bready, dry. I'll probably give it quite a bit of carbonation as well, but I want it to give that pseudo champagne experience or pseudo sparkling wine experience, but in a beer. So if I can do that, it's going to be really pale. There's no caramel malts or crystal malts or anything like that in there. So it's still deciding again how fine to filter it, because there's a lot of specialty grains and all sorts in there, but we'll see what happens.
Now, when you use the Nelson Sauvin as a wet hop, what do you expect to get out of it that you wouldn't as a dry hop?
You get a lot more grassiness. You get kind of a little bit of sort of, I find early stages, particularly when it's at the warm part, because I like doing a lot of my dry hopping or wet dry hopping slightly warmer, just in terms of oil sort of utilization from those hops. You get a little bit oniony, garlicky, kind of that summity sort of like note that you can get, but it generally fades off, particularly when the beer's cold again. Or it's if I add that champagne yeast as well and hopefully get a small amount of re-fermentation, it will hopefully drive some of that character off. But yeah, it's...
Now maybe I could pick your brain about that a little bit, because a lot of people talk about when you dry hop in the presence of continued yeast activity, maybe in the case of a cask conditioned beer, or you have a beer that hasn't completely fermented out and you add the dry hops warm at that stage, the interaction between the yeast and the hop oils. Have you, in your brewing and you're working with these hops, have you found a difference between a beer that's completely fermented out versus a beer that still has yeast in suspension with regards to dry hopping?
That's a very good question. Yes and no. I think there are a couple of factors at play. Number one, when you've got nucleation points and carbon dioxide in solution and potentially still got some active fermentation, you're going to get a lot of movement. And if you can move around small particles of hops that have got oils in them, you're going to be increasing the potential surface area interaction within the liquid. So that's a positive thing. The negative thing is you're probably looking at about 30 to 40% absorption of those oils onto yeast cells. So you could argue that if you've added quite a lot of hops into the kettle to begin with, there's not going to be a lot of active sites left on every individual yeast cell for absorption, because they're going to be pretty jam-packed anyway. I do something quite odd, not a lot of brewers do it, and that's because of the geometry of my conical fermenters. I find it very difficult to get enough yeast off for repitching, so I have to take the yeast off after dry hopping. So I've effectively got sort of particularly in that initial pitch, a lot of yeast, a lot of oil already over that yeast. So if we're getting a biomass increase, in that sort of growth phase of pre-fermentation of 4 to 6 times, that means that I've probably got sort of maybe 20 to 25% of those cells are already pretty, jam-packed with oils. Hopefully not enough to allow them to still bud and do that sort of thing. And then all that other sort of 80% biomass, in theory, is going to get some coating from the hop oils that have come through from the kettle as well. So it's probably one of those equilibrium things. And then the other cool thing is you can just dry hop, do more dry hop, be more clever with your dry hop. This yeast flocculates quite well as fermentation ends, so I take off Trube and any cold break generally before day one of fermentation, about 10 or so litres. But then because of how
they're quite squat.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
The fermenters he's pointing to, folks, are they're very squat, and the cones are very wide and short and fat.
So, I mean, if you think about that surface area where you've probably got maybe near the end of fermentation, you might have 80% of your yeast flocculated out already, and you've just got that surface there. Most of that yeast is under there anyway. So you might only have, I haven't got this is the only brewery I've ever worked in where I'm not doing yeast counts, but I might only have at that stage, maybe sort of 3 or 4 million cells per milliliter yeast count. So, if I look at the sample, it's generally not super hazy. So hopefully it's a CO2 release that's helping that move around, and there's that kind of stable layer on the bottom of these short fat cones that'll be stopping all of that oil absorption. So it'll go up to about 10 grams per litre. So I might put about 22 pounds into sort of 9 barrels, something like that. Might be a decent dry hop for an IPA that I'll do here. So, and then spread that out over anything up to 3 days to maximise surface area interaction. So I'm not just getting like a giant green sludgy carpet floating on the top and sinking down all at the same time. So it's just kind of, I think, monitoring those sorts of processes and being one with the fermenter.
Be one with the fermenter. I like it.
Yeah. So
I would assume you have these in a bag, right? You've got
correct.
Them tied
Yeah,
up
I've actually got some rugby ball bags, like football training.
Yeah.
For training, you take all the balls in like a mesh bag. So it's like a nylon mesh, and I just soak that in a sanitizer. So those in the sanitizer solution, and then hang them from the spray ball. So they're hanging sort of just above my runoff point. It sits at about 15 litres at the bottom of the tank, so they'll just hang above there and not block it up when I'm transferring to my next stage. So I'll transfer this hopefully in about a week and a half onto a fining solution. I usually do an isinglass fining, particularly with this Brettanomyces strain, to help it drop out of suspension, and then probably do an 8 micron cartridge filter.
Now, you're working with a lot of bacteria. Talk to me just briefly about repitching that bacteria. Have you found that you can just harvest it off the bottom of the fermenter?
So the actual bacteria I'm only really using in the kettle. What I've done is taken samples of that and then inoculated wort, and things particularly, lactic acid bacteria, particularly those strains will work better at around 42 degrees Celsius, which Fahrenheit I'd have to, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Yeah. So, what's body temperature in Fahrenheit for you guys?
Body temperature in Fahrenheit is about 98 degrees.
Okay, so you're looking probably 100 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit is where that's optimal. So if I'm wanting to take some of that lacto culture and grow it up in some more wort, I'm really lucky. I've got a nice high temperature, high pressure boiler around the corner. So putting anything on that usually sits at around sort of 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. So a little bit under, probably sort of in the late 80s, something like that. So that'll mean that it'll slowly tick over. But it's something the culture that I use, I buy it in a freeze-dried form and then just go for it, sprinkle it on, and it works as magic. I probably could hydrate it into a starter to speed up the souring process when I do my kettle sours, but it's one of those things where the method works. I can sort of play around with my brewing week and make sure that I've got the time to finish the process.
And with the Brettanomyces, are you able to harvest that out of the fermenter?
Yeah, I harvest that. So this will be it's a combination of a Generation 2 and a Generation 3 Brettanomyces. It's about 50% of both cultures. One strain is a mixture of the Wyeast Trois strain, and the other one is the BSI Dry strain. So pretty much they'll be the same thing. Arguably you could say it's not a Brett beer because I think they've just reclassified it as Saccharomyces purpulensis. So, but I think the brewing world will continue to call it Brettanomyces for a long time. So in theory it's not a Brett beer, but for most people that sort of want to know what sort of yeast it is, I just call it Brett Brooks. So
works for me.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but the main reason I wanted to come and talk to you is I've been going around Wellington drinking beer. I've been encountering a lot of kind of stabs at American style beer made by brewers here in New Zealand. I've had a few that seem to be kind of uniquely New Zealand beers. But what really stood out to me when I drank your beer in here last night was I had the Golden Ale that had won a medal. I had what is it called? God Zone. I also had the God Zone. And both of them, I tasted those beers with all the New Zealand hops in them, and I just said, wow, we've been using these hops wrong in the U.S. You are able to coax some flavors and some aromas out of those hops that I've never encountered before, certainly in a U.S.-made beer, and really in some of these other ones too. So I guess, I'm hoping maybe you could talk to us just a little bit about, in your mind, what is a New Zealand style of beer? What's a good New Zealand ale? And talk to us a little bit about how you're able to get such wonderful complexities out of these New Zealand hops without what would seem to be without really very high hopping rates.
Yeah, it's a really the big thing for me is I'm all about kind of hop bursting the hell out of beers, like really chucking a lot in at flame out. Things like whirlpooling and soaking times are really important. Try to never let it go over sort of 25 minutes, I find, before you're starting to cool the wort. We all know hop oils are as volatile as hell, so you want to, if you've somehow got a way in your brewery of cooling that wort as quickly as you can, if you're setting up a brewery, whether it be a small brewery or a big brewery, and have got the capital to buy twice the size heat exchanger that you need, do it. That's sort of probably the first thing. If you can do a transfer from boiling to fermentation temperature in 20 minutes, then you're going to get a better beer, or even if you do it less time. So that's one thing that I think is important. Saying that, though, I'm still looking at probably between a 35 and 45 minute transfer, depending on whether I'm doing a lager or a cool or a warm ferment. But the other thing is to really think about is just how you dry hop, and my biggest theory about dry hopping is yeast strain. Actually, I think the yeast strain is the most important thing. So I use a unusual yeast strain for all of my beers, and probably I don't trick people, but I'm pretty open about what I do. I use the California Common strain, and for my what I call ales, my ale style beers, I ferment them at between 18 and 21 degrees Celsius, so very warm ale style. Even though they kind of say that should be maxed out, that yeast at around 18 degrees Celsius. And then for my lagers, starting at 14, and I might ramp up for diacetyl rest around 17 or 18 degrees. And that's from me playing around with loads of different yeast strains, lots of ale strains, American ale yeast, this, that, everything else, and finding that this strain in particular just makes the hops just absolutely shine. Whatever beer style I'm doing, generally it's awesome.
So the majority of the ales that I've sampled in here have been made with that yeast strain.
Yeah, and I always have this argument. Actually, I'm about to do an interview with our local sort of magazine, The Pursuit of Hoppiness, with a guy talking about this exact thing, that I think we forget that the genome, if you look at the genomics of an ale strain, it's probably about 70 to 80% lager strain anyway. So it begs the question, what are we doing? Is it a top fermenting? Is it bottom fermenting? And the other curious sort of thing I always talk about is if I'm taking a top fermenting yeast and constantly collecting it from the bottom of a tank, and doing it over 20 or 30 generations, you're naturally selecting those possibly those quick flocculators and bottom fermenters and that sort of thing anyway. So for me, it's about the people who come and drink the beer don't want to read a précis on what is beer and what is a beer style every time they drink a beer. They want to know, does that taste like the IPA that I like from that brewery? So I go, yep, this is my interpretation of an India Pale Ale. It's never seen a barrel. It hasn't crossed the equator twice in a boat to go to the colonies of the Dutch East India Trading Company or anything like that. But it's it's all about interpretation, and you want to make it easy for people who want to enjoy a beer. So if the beer tastes like an IPA or it tastes like a pale ale, and I've made it exactly in that method except for the yeast strain that I've used, and that's what I'll tell people. But I'm not afraid of if people want to know what yeast strain I'm using and how I'm doing it, I'll tell them that as well. So it's good, and this is the only brewery I've ever worked in. I've worked in a number of breweries around the sort of world, and this is the only brewery I've really used this yeast strain in to great effect. And it's that classic thing where not all yeast strains will match all breweries either. So again, this is 20 different yeast strains I've sort of played with. A lot of them are specialty yeast, but for my core yeast, like all your US-05s and your American ale yeast and West Yorkshire ale yeast and all these different ale yeast strains, I just wasn't getting what I wanted from the hops. And this yeast strain, when I started off using it in my lager and my pilsner, I'm like, I'll give it a try in my ales to see what happens. And all of a sudden, the beers went from here to here, and yeah.
Well, that yeast also seems to be leaving behind a very lovely, tight but rich malt character as well.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us maybe a little bit about the malt you use? Are you using New Zealand malt? Or are you using imported malt?
Yeah, mostly, probably about 95% New Zealand malt. I use, at this stage in the brewing, I've sort of toed and fro between using malt from both of our suppliers here. But at the moment, I'm probably using about 80% of the malt by maltings done in just out of Christchurch called Gladfield. So most of that malt, that barley's grown around there and malted by probably it's our only, I guess, craft maltings really. But yeah, they do awesome stuff, really good stuff. So
do you know what the barley variety is?
I don't actually. No. I probably did know once, but it's a I've definitely got it written down somewhere. But it's it's something that I generally, for my base malt, will use. Probably 85% of my beers will be Pilsner or a light Pilsner malt, really pale. They don't throw out too much S-methylmethionine, DMS precursors. There's minimal of that sort of stuff in it, which is great. I've only got I only do a 60-minute boil, and then I've got a vapor condenser. I haven't got a chimney, so it's a matter of making sure I've got pretty good malt that doesn't leave any of that behind. I was trained my first ever brewer as a trainee brewer was like Heineken standard stuff, so we learned pretty hard out to pick up DMS and all those sorts of things. So I'm pretty sort of sensitive to it.
So I guess I should ask that question. Where were you trained initially?
So yeah, I studied food chemistry and microbiology degrees at university, and had a lecturer who was a brewing professor that had come from the Catholic University in Leuven in Belgium. So he was quite an established brewing scientist, mostly around kind of sulfite and yeast fermentation, kind of esters and all that sort of stuff. Jean-Pierre Dufour, his name is, the late Jean-Pierre Dufour, and so that was where initially sort of my interest was piqued, and then went into one of the two at that stage big breweries here, which is called DB Breweries. They were owned by Asia Pacific Breweries and Heineken Breweries, and they use continuous fermentation techniques. So I started off as a trainee brewer there. It was a 2-year program, and I ran the microbiology lab for a good amount of that time as well. And learnt the dark art of continuous fermentation, which is that's another podcast altogether, I think.
Certainly.
But yeah, so that was my background, and then went over and brewed up in Scotland for a wee while, a place called Fine Ales, and then from there went to a small brewery in the middle of England called Thornbridge Brewery, which is in Derbyshire, and it was quite a small operation when I started there, and then it's now a very big operation, or a decent sized operation. They do some great beers. I think they export a bit of beer to the US now as well. So it's and then from there back here to New Zealand and worked for a company called Epic Brewing Company, and who were known for their really big American hopped beers. And then where did I go? Jeez, I've been everywhere. So I started up a brew pub a little bit bigger than this called Good George, which is in Hamilton, and they're doing some really great stuff as well. And then started up a very small brewery in my hometown for my brother, a 300-litre brewery called Brew Mountain. And then Colin, who owns this place in Malt House in Courtney Place, a really great beer pub here in Wellington, lured me here and said, come and be a brewer and do 20 different beers and have lots of fun. And yeah, the world is your oyster stout. So yeah, that's pretty much the process, really. Yeah,
well, there you have it, Kelly Ryan. The world is his oyster stout.
Exactly.
And I will say he's making the most of it. The beers are delicious and really have stood out among the things I've tasted while I'm here in Wellington. Maybe you could just leave us with a final word. Maybe what does it mean to you to make a New Zealand style beer or a New Zealand ale?
Oh, it's about, we talk about terroir a lot, and it's about putting the terroir of New Zealand ingredients into a glass. When you sip that and you smell that, you're tasting this exact country. Right? And that's particularly with our New Zealand Pale Ale, God's Own Beat. This is God's own country. So it's an apt name for a pretty good New Zealand Pale Ale.
Well, that's exactly what I thought when I drank it. When you come over to a new place and you try beers, you don't know what you're going to find exactly. And when I drank God's Own, I said, this is kind of what I thought New Zealand beer would taste like. It's recognizable as kind of having English roots, but it's definitely got a flavor that's unto itself. And when I sat there and I took notes on the different characters I was getting from the hops, and it's about half a page just of different descriptors. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your hops. Let me get this out of my hand so I can shake your hand.
Awesome. Cheers, Will.
And really appreciate you giving us a little of your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, thanks again to Will, and thanks to Kelly for taking time to share his advice. We didn't get up to Wellington, and I'm jealous. But that's definitely a stop I'd like to make in the future. Next week, we begin our June break. We'll see you back here in July. Hope to see you in Baltimore, too. If you see us at HomebrewCon, please stop us and say howdy. Until then, if you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to James at basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. Please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcasts. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. You can get a free Basic Brewing bottle opener with any DVD combo, and you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store as well. You can find our logbooks where you can track and log up to 50 batches of beer. Check all that out at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Louisville Slugger Portable Pitching Screen and a Tech City Digital Hanging Postal Luggage Scale. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. And don't forget, you can also join the American Homebrewers Association or subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. Well, that's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.